Okay, so just a little extra example about the square root property. It's a really useful tool for solving certain types of quadratics. So remember, when you have quadratics look like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, right? That's our standard form. We have a couple different tools here. Factoring is a great tool. If you haven't already, you will soon learn the quadratic formula, which is also a good tool. Quadratic formula always works, but it's a little complicated. Factoring is very simple, but it only works sometimes. And in that same sort of category, the square root property is very nice, but only works sometimes. So let's look at some examples where it works. The most simple example is something like this: x squared minus 5 equals 0. So that is a quadratic. It doesn't have that x term, and that makes it a good candidate here for the square root property, right? X squared equals 5. The square root property says if you have something squared equals 5, that leads to two solutions: plus the square root of 5 and minus the square root of 5, or plus minus the square root of 5 if you're being a little lazy, right? A shortcut. So those are the easiest ones, right? It's very straightforward. There's no complicated simplification or anything like that. That's the kind of easiest square root property. But you'll also run into ones that look like this. This one is a little bit different looking, but it is still possible to solve this one with the square root property. Unlike some of the other situations, we want to get the squared part alone on one side, which means not a 0 here on the other side. And then the square root property says what's being squared has to equal plus or minus the square root of the other side. So to get rid of the minus 2 there, I'm going to add the 2 over to the other side, and I get x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of minus 3. I want to simplify as I square roots of 3. Right? I don't want to leave the negative inside, and that comes out as an I, which we want to put in front. So these then are my two solutions to that problem. There are other versions, but that's those are pretty much the two main types that we would want to use the square root property for, and that is the easiest way to solve those kinds of problems. You can solve this one by the quadratic formula, but it's actually quite a bit harder. You got to square this out and combine terms together and then use the quadratic formula. This is a much better approach. If you, I think there's a different video on completing the square. So completing the square is basically a strategy to take a quadratic that looks like this and turn it into a quadratic that looks like this that we can solve with the square root property. And it involves a little bit of moving and adding things around to adjust. So again, there's another video on this, but the rule is you always add half of that middle term squared. So half of that squared is 16, half of 8 is 4, squared is 16. I've got to add that to both sides. What that does is it allows me to factor this left side. Now normally we wouldn't want to factor equal to 13, that wouldn't help us, but it does work if it factors as a perfect square, x plus 4 and x plus 4, because then I get x plus 4 squared equals 13, and now I can use the square root property to solve that. X plus 4 has to equal plus or minus the square root of 13. So x equals minus 4 plus or minus the square root of 13. So That's the square root property in action. Hope that helps.